Look at that. Recording in progress. Good stuff. Okay, well, I'll begin. Hello, my name is Dr. Richard McCulloch. I'm a senior lecturer in media and film at the University of Huddersfield. I'm really delighted to welcome all of you today to Working in Telly is Bad for You. This afternoon's event is co-organised by University of Huddersfield. We were hoping to have this in person at Huddersfield, but events kind of took over us there. But yeah, co-organised by the University of Huddersfield and SIGN, the Screen Industries Growth Network, who you'll be hearing from in just a few minutes. Now, we have three really exciting panels for you today. You're going to be hearing from a selection of both academics and industry professionals, all of whom are going to be talking to us about some really fascinating research on the TV industry and the experiences of people who work within that industry. Now, the name of the event, Working in Telly is Bad for You, should probably give you some fairly blunt clues as to sort of the tone of what some of this research reveals. No mincing of the words here. But I'd say that's appropriate because our speakers today are going to be delivering, frankly, some quite hard truths about the UK television industry and, by extension, the wider sort of cultural and creative sector in this country. And in particular, in relation to some of the various inequalities that exist within TV. So inequalities of pay, working conditions, access, professional mobility, and of course, various forms of privilege and discrimination, including class, race, gender, sexuality, and so on. And of course, many of these inequalities have been quite profoundly exacerbated by the COVID pandemic, which I would say makes the need to address and understand, rather the other way around, understand and then address these problems all the more pressing. But it is worth saying that this, the aim of this seminar, the aim of this event is not simply to point to lots of stuff and go, look how terrible stuff is. There will be plenty of that, we're not going to lie. But it's also about thinking about where we can go next. So we're obviously not going to solve anything today in the space of a few hours, but with the speakers and attendees that we have here, if you're in the room, that means you too, we want to work towards, what do we do next? So the final panel of the afternoon, with that in mind, will be dedicated to laying down some foundations for future research in this area. What do we know now? Where do we need to examine next? Okay, that's really all I wanted to say by way of an introduction, but I'll just a couple of brief points of housekeeping before we proceed, and then I'll hand over to John and Rowan. So first of all, you probably noticed, but the panels, we are recording this session. So the panels will be recorded, the Q&As will not. So, if that helps in relation to things that you wanted to ask or wanted to share, those Q&As bits where we invite you to ask things and say things, those bits aren't going to be recorded. Secondly, please, if everyone could mute your microphones unless you are speaking, that would really help, cut out any, interference, feedback, things like that. Participation, feel free to tweet unless one of the speakers asks you not to tweet something specifically. But yeah, please do tweet about the event and any ideas that you've had from it, any of the speakers, anything like that, using the hashtag Telly is Bad for You. So a shortened version of the full title. And as I mentioned, we will be having Q&As after every panel. Okay, so we would really love to hear from you. We've got a really great mix of, I've looked at the delegate list, we've got a great mix of people here in the room today. So let's take advantage of that. We're all in the same virtual space at least. So please do come forward, share any reflections, stories of your own experiences, perhaps working in the industry, or questions, things you'd like a speaker to elaborate on, for example. So if you do want to participate in the Q&As, there are two main ways you can do this. Firstly, if something occurs to you at any point in the afternoon, so during a panel or during a Q&A, you can type something into the chat box at the bottom as you go along. You can do that at any time. And then when it comes to the Q&A, the chair of that panel can read out your question, or when you type it in, you can say, I'd like to read this out myself, and we can go, okay, so-and-so's got a question, over to you, right? So that's the first option, is to type it into the chat box. The other option is to wait for the Q&A to come around and press the raise hand button, which should be under the reactions. If you look at the bottom of the Zoom window, it says reactions and then raise hand. If you don't have that option, it's probably because you're not using the right version of Zoom. So you might need to update. You can do that in one of the breaks. So yeah, and we'll have 15 minutes for each Q&A afterwards. So plenty of time for a good few people to speak up. There is also the option to ask anonymous questions or say something anonymously if you would like to. In order to do that, if you want to speak anonymously, use the chat function, but go to the bottom where it says the default option is to everyone, and just change it to and address it to the chair of that panel instead. So that will mean you can ask things anonymously, and just mention in the quote, just clarify, please don't read my name out, and they won't. Finally, this hopefully should go without saying, but just to be very, very clear, abuse of any kind, whether it's directed towards speakers or other attendees, won't be tolerated. Harriet will be staying on top of that, and you will be booted out if any of that happens. But I'm sure it won't happen, but you know, just to be clear, if everyone could just be courteous and constructive with comments and things like that, that would be really great. And one final thing to say is that to watch out for a post-event survey that will be sent round, I think tomorrow. I think it'll come as an Eventbrite email. So yeah, please watch out for that and fill it in when it arrives, which will help us reflect on how the event's gone and what we're going to do in the future. Okay, that's it from me for now. And I'm going to hand over to, I think it's John next.
Anna first.
Anna, sorry.
Hello everyone. Hi Richard. Thank you very much for the intro and the helpful tips about how this event is going to be run. It sounds great. So I'm Anna Einarsdóttir. I am the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead for this project SIGN, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But I'm also a reader in management at the University of York. I hope that I'm going to seamlessly sort of later on introduce John and Rowan and their project into the Time project. But a few words on the SIGN project for those who are not familiar with it. So as Richard said in the opening, SIGN stands for Screen Industry Growth Network. And this project was actually generously funded by Research England a few years back. Now the project has two aims. First is to empower people, and then secondly is to enable growth in the industry, focus on the Yorkshire and Humber region. Now this is a very large and multifaceted project. It has 4 working streams, one being on business and support, another one focusing on skills and training. There is the theme on research, which John incidentally belongs to. And then fourthly, the EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion work stream that cuts across all the other themes that I currently lead on. I joined this summer, so I'm fairly new to the project. But just a kind of brief snapshot from the EDI work stream. There's lots of activities going on and happened in the past. One thing that we're immensely proud of that was produced, I think just over a year ago, was the Industry Voices project, which is a research-led interviews with people who face discrimination in the screen industries. We also have quite a lot of placement opportunities and some ongoing at this minute in time. We offer early career support, which consists of 6 months of training and mentoring extensive scheme for those who are just starting out in their careers. And I'm pleased to say that we just opened the bursary scheme that has taken a while to come off the ground, but we're really, really proud of this initiative. So the bursary schemes is aimed for people struggling to get into the industry and to advance their career. So the bursary scheme offers financial support to make use of employment opportunity or for training by supporting people of different backgrounds. So then on what we have on the horizon, there's two really exciting things happening. One is we're in the process in developing, and I will tell you the details of it once it's up and running. But briefly speaking, it is one-stop shop that we are in the process of designing, which is for businesses looking to maximize EDI opportunities. So for example, if they need an advice or a bit of training, they're really not sure how to embed EDI principles in their work and what that looks like. This is the type of one-stop shop where we'd have working with consultants in the industry that would, and people with real expertise in different fields that we can direct people to. And the second thing, which I'm really, really excited about, is that we are about to embark on a research into the impact of diversity schemes on career trajectories. So we really are interested to know in the immediate effects of people who take on opportunities, who engage in diversity schemes. You know, what is the immediate benefit advantage of that? And then more importantly, we're really interested in the longer term view. So does it really matter that people have been able to take part in such schemes? And if so, how? And these are the sort of questions that we'll be looking to answer in the year to come or so. So that's all for now on the SIME scheme. So now I think it's time to kick off or kickstart this amazing event, which sounds really exciting. So the first session is on the TIME project. And I'll just allow Rowan and John to introduce themselves. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I'm just going to share my slides. Yeah, so thank you for that, Anna. My name's John Swords. As Anna mentioned, I lead the research work strand on SIGN, and I'm also a senior research fellow at the University of York. And Rowan will introduce herself in a moment. But we're going to talk today about some of the key findings from the TIME project. But it's important to state that this has been a team effort over the last perhaps 16, 18 months or so. The research team involved myself, Claire Boardman and Anna Ozimek from the University of York, and Laura Main, who's at the University of Hull. And we're going to give you an overview of some of the key findings today. There's a lot more detail in the report, which you can find on the Screen Industries Growth Network website, which goes into much more detail. But today we're going to focus mainly on the hours that people are working, although the full report does include data on pay rate and also contracts. So to kick us off, Rowan's going to talk to us a little bit about the background of the project.
Hello there, my name's Rowan Ost. I am a lecturer at Huddersfield in the Media and Performance Department, and I am part of SMTJ as a co-director of SMTJ, which stands, for anyone who doesn't know, as for Share My Telly Job. And again, a brief introduction to us for anyone who is unaware. We were founded in 2015. By Louise Patel, who, after having her first child, realised it was impossible for her to go back to work. So she founded Share My Telly Job as a way to promote and advocate for job sharing. Natalie Grant, who is also a series producer, Lou remains a gallery director and edit producer. Natalie Grant joined soon after, and Michelle James Reynolds, who was then a casting producer, joined not long after that. I joined them in about 2 years ago now. I encountered SMTJ through my own research into motherhood. And out of the conversations we had around our shared experiences of motherhood and working in television, I should say in a previous life, I was also a news producer. We realized that time, or the lack of it, or the mismanagement of it, was the commonality that kind of underscored all of the problems that we perceived for workers in television. And this kind of went across the scope of TV from and across the career trajectories of working in TV. So whether it was recruitment, scheduling, contracts, rates, management, and budgets, it was time for new entrants was very difficult. Training, staff retention, and all of these kind of intersected in problems for diversity. So very long days, and the endemic culture of very long days just accumulated into what was frankly quite terrible practice. And so we devised this app to measure how many hours people worked by job role, by protected characteristic. And we rolled it out with the help of Sign. And I think that's where we got to talking to John Swords about it. I don't think I've missed anything, have I, John? It's very strange, I can't see him.
Yeah, yeah, we should also admit we've not practiced this together. So yeah, bear with us. But yeah, I think that's a really good background. And as kind of Rowan mentioned, this has been an iterative process. We piloted last winter a series of questions to help us hone those questions, and also the mode of delivery with about 100 people. And the engagement was really encouraging and demonstrated to us all that this was a worthwhile project to be doing and something that people were very concerned about. And after the pilot, share my Telly job and the research team worked with a company called Outlandish, who are a tech cooperative, to build that platform, that app that Rowan mentioned, to record the data. And so when people sign up, we ask them questions about their individual personal characteristics, their history in TV. And then as they engage more, people share with us their contract details and of course the time that they're working on their different jobs. If you're interested, the question set is can be found in the appendices of the report. And we started collecting data last spring. And across 6 months, we had nearly 500 participants taking part who were working across 600 different contracts, and in total were contributing 73,000 hours of work to the UK's TV industry. So this is a significant sample of work that we were able to analyse. It wasn't perfect, but we were appreciative that people were working in a pandemic, and finishing a long day and then entering more data at the end of the day is quite a difficult task. Here you can see some of the demographics of the participants. Almost 2/3 were female, over 40% were in their 30s, and 89% were white. 10% had some kind of long-term physical and mental health issue, and more than half were based in London, and 22% of the sample have children. That last figure is particularly significant because if you look at the workforce across the whole of the UK, 38% of people have dependents, whereas in TV it's lower for various reasons. So we stopped short of claiming statistical representativeness of the whole industry, but we are confident that this represents the experience of a significant proportion of people working in TV. Indeed, when we shared insights with people working in the industry, they recognised the data very strongly, and the conclusions rang true with them. And we think this is what is most important, that a high proportion of workers are experiencing the long hours that we found, and they are facing the consequences of that. So what I want to do now is move on to look at some of our key findings. And again, just to reiterate, this is mainly on working time, but we did collect, analyse information on contracts, on pay, and those details are in the full report because there's some significant pay gaps that we found. So the big headline is that in our data set, the average working day was almost 10.5 hours. And when we've mentioned this to people working in television, they kind of nodded and went, yes, that's right. And that's kind of become normalised, but it isn't normal. The UK average across the economy is almost over 3 hours less than that, at 7.2 hours. And when you start to think about this across a week, a 5-day week, which was the most common contract for participants, that's a 50-hour week. And that takes those people that are over the UK Working Time Directive. And for those people here who work in TV will know that often contracts ask you to waive your right to the working time directive so you can work those longer hours. So across a full week then, 10.4-hour days means that on average, people in TV are working 2 additional days compared to the rest of the UK workforce, which is too much. And particularly when you think that the average break that people told us about was just half an hour. And on 20% of days entered into the data set, people weren't able to take a break at all. So if we think about who are doing it, and the other thing to say is that across the data set, men are working slightly longer than women, but this varies by role and by age. If we think about who it is that's working longer hours, then it's people working in craft and tech jobs. So you can see here, for instance, that people working in hair and makeup, they're doing the longest hours at almost 12-hour days, closely followed by electricians. And of course, these are the people that are often there first and have to leave last as well. These figures are followed by runners who are doing almost 11-hour days. And of course, the runners are usually the lowest paid workers on a crew. And even though the average is quite tight, there is a significant proportion of responses of doing very long days. The longest was 23.8 hours, and almost 20% of days were over 12 hours long. The length of the day that people are working is influenced by a range of different factors, including the role that people are doing, but also the location people are working. And you can see some of that data in this table. Here we can see that those working in offices or working from home are doing days which are below average, but those working in studios, on set or on location are doing the longest days. Another determining factor of the hours people are working is the type of television that people are making. So it varies by genre. So people working in sport, film, and high-end TV are generally doing the longest hours, whereas people working in reality or children's programming are generally working the lowest. And what was interesting to look was to kind of combine different data that people shared with us to get a picture of what people's lives and what people's working life was like, to build some vignettes, some different profiles of people who are taking part in the project. And we've got some examples here which show that it's not just the hours that they're working, it's what they're doing around those hours which really adds up. So Sarah, for example, is a producer in her 40s working in Thatcher Entertainment. The data she entered shows that she's working almost 11 hours a day, but she's also doing a 2-hour commute, and she has children on top of this. And to compound these long hours, she was only taking an average break of 13 minutes a day. This is similar to Siobhan, who's in her 30s, working as a senior producer, regularly works a 10-hour day and has a 2 to 3 hour work by train in addition to that. And this is echoed in a number of different profiles that we can see. Emmy here, for example, works in hair and makeup, been in the industry over 10 years, working in unscripted factual entertainment shows, consistently doing 14-hour days without the commute, and she has childcare responsibilities when she gets home. And it's important to think about what the consequences of these long hours are, because 10-hour days means that you can't do other things. For instance, 10-hour days means it's not enough time to be physically or mentally healthy. I suspect many people here will be aware of the Brick Crew Stories Instagram account, which posts anonymous insights from people working in film and TV in the UK. And some of those contributions are really quite scary and quite worrying. There's one here, for example, where they're talking about doing 12-hour days with a 2.5-hour commute either side. And this person was really struggling to adjust. They say, I tried to talk to my line manager about my exhaustion and was told that if I can't hack it, I should do everyone a favour and go home. And that kind of attitude is very worrying, particularly when you look at the mental health crisis in the film and TV sector. So a couple of years ago, the film and TV charity ran a survey particularly looking at mental health. And they found that 87% of respondents had experienced a mental health problem at some point in their lives, compared to 65% across the UK population. And 55% of respondents had contemplated taking their own life, compared with 20% of people nationally. This is a major problem, and working long hours is exacerbating the conditions that people are facing. A 10-hour day also means you don't have enough time for caring. You can't do the school run if you're working a day which is 8 until 6. And work commissioned by Share My Telly Job and Telly Mumsnet and carried out by academics at Nottingham University for the Locked Down, Locked Out report kind of shows the impact of this during the pandemic, with almost half of respondents saying that they were unable to accept work due to childcare issues at the height of the pandemic, related to school closures and bubbles being sent home. And 61% of respondents said they had seriously considered leaving the industry during the pandemic because of these sorts of issues. And working on sign, as Anna mentioned, one of our key work strands is skills and training, and that was developed because there are major skills gaps and shortages of different roles in the industry. But that's not particularly surprising given some of the conditions, and also there's not enough time when you're working 10-hour days to undertake training or career development, which isn't done on the job. So even just from a purely selfish instrumental perspective, the industry needs to get a handle on this, because they're losing good people. And the UK TV industry won't be able to maintain its reputation if it can't get the people with the necessary skills, particularly with developments of things like virtual production, which are going to be potentially drastically changing different job roles. And then finally for me, before I pass back from Rowan, a 10-hour day doesn't allow time for robust recruitment practices. You know, the whole kind of networking, employing people you've worked with before, isn't the fairest way to employ people, and exacerbates many of the issues that we've seen. And in the data set that we have, people said that across the whole data set, 45% of contracts, people said, had no clearly stated hours. Many of them didn't have any hours, or it was ambiguous. Pay rates were also not transparent, and particularly relating to overtime, where some people would qualify for overtime, many people wouldn't. So all these factors then become mutually reinforcing and reproduce the kinds of exploitation, discrimination, and exclusion that Rowan and others of today's speakers have written about. And it's a really vicious cycle which needs to change. And so we have a series of recommendations that I'm going to pass back to Rowan to talk about.
Hello again. So really recommendations quite obviously are about management, a change to management culture. So the question then becomes how this is induced or regulated or forced, or the mechanisms which we can develop to do that. So we recommend, we found various areas where this needs to be. So a consistency, reduction is hours, sorry, firstly, with more realistic schedules, which is related to budgets, as we will come to, because without the adequate budgets, it's impossible to build realistic schedules. Consistent contracting practice is a regulatory point. How do we regulate, though, then becomes the question. Workers need clearer guidance, and that's another regulatory point, but it's also about the culture within the production companies and broadcasters and streamers around how allowing production managers the time to actually communicate and build in these measures into contracts. And the point around specifically to production managers that they have become additionally burdened during COVID with new COVID protocols, while they haven't actually received any kind of additional staff or additional time to put those into place. This relates to the next point around commissioning organisations giving sufficient time to production companies, and whether this again presents another problem of how do you puzzle that through when there's a huge disparity between tariffs between the broadcasters, the traditional broadcasters, and the streamers. I don't want to get into allow this work to be kind of used to bash the BBC, but there needs to be a level of accountability that includes potentially a levy from the streamers to allow for this, because they just have so much more money. And then things like workers should be compensated for overtime. Again, that's a way of inducing change. But as with flexible working, we often hear from, particularly women, they feel inhibited in asking for flexible working. So, you know, there needs to be a shift in the management culture from the top to allow people and to encourage people to actually ask for this. And more time and resources needed to allow workers to undertake training and develop their careers beyond learning on the job. This is, I think, especially pertinent to new entrants, but it's also a question around extending and kind of loosening career trajectories. There needs to be more work done. I think Nat Grant's going to talk about this more later, around career trajectories and how women, and in particular, happens around maternity, but other marginalised groups are effectively excluded from these so-called training opportunities because they perhaps lack the networks that the more privileged entrants have even before they start their jobs. And more time is needed for a proper work-life balance that allows people literally time to live their lives beyond work. And I think I'm going to talk about the ambitions now. So next steps of the Time Project. We want it to continue. It will continue and continue to build the data set, demonstrating the things we know anecdotally. But these are recommendations for what specific groups within the industry can do. So employers do not use buyout contracts. I sounded slightly Australian then, forgive me. People cannot and should not be expected to work an unlimited number of hours. And we hope that it will simply become culturally unacceptable to use these buyout contracts as people become more confident in using the language that resists these buyout contracts. Monitor working hours and breaks during using the Time Project. So we are currently developing a dashboard for production companies and broadcasters to use that will both retain the anonymity of their workers while also monitoring project by project how many hours those workers are doing. So it will be a way of reporting good practice and monitoring where practice is getting out of hand, and a mechanism by which we hope production companies can demonstrate to the commissioning organisations that they are not allowing enough money to build adequate schedules for particular stretches in the production workflow. We know, for example, it's a particular problem at the moment around pre-production. And employers can also communicate about and budget for reasonable adjustments, childcare, travel days, flexible working, etc., with the hope that long days, because production does require long days, sometimes becomes exceptional. Broadcasters and studios, again, as I mentioned, pre-production is a particular problem at the moment. Tariffs need to include lines for newer practices around COVID, wellbeing, and post-Brexit travel changes, which are, the system of carnets is becoming increasingly complicated and is again often landed solely on the desk of production managers. And using the Time Project to understand where budgets and schedules are not allowing time to produce shows in a safe or sustainable way. So, and again, this relates back to what we've been talking about throughout this half hour about communication, but opening up these lines of communication and allowing time to communicate around where the problematic areas are. And then finally, workers. Use the Time Project, record your hours and rates. Please join BEC2. We are supported by and affiliated with BEC2, and we talk to them a lot about how to improve working conditions and look out for each other, talk about rates and keep reporting bad practice. Additionally, there is a real culture of not wanting to be seen as complaining. And that has to be worked on. And I think that's it from me. I think I've run over time, sorry.
Thank you everyone for listening. If you're interested in signing up for the Time Project, you can see the address there. And if you're interested in reading the report, there's an address there, and I'm sure someone's probably already linked it into the chat. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you both so much for this, some sombering figures there and quite worrying, and maybe not all that surprising to many of us. Presenting multiple EDI challenges in 10 plus hours a day. I mean, who can do it, and for how long, and how sustainable is this? And incidentally, I'd just like to mention that one of the projects that Sign is supporting is the Inclusive Growth Project, that is aiming to, one of the things that they're doing is to map the workforce in the Yorkshire and Humber region anyway. But I see we have got some questions for John and Rowan, and please do feel free to post.
Harry, if you could, one step ahead of me, straight in there. Okay, so we are now here for the second panel of today, which I'm going to be chairing. So any, if there's any anonymous questions or comments, you can direct them in the chat towards me, or you can just continue as people have been doing, highlighting, sorry, if you can type comments or questions in the chat as we go, you're welcome to do that too. The format of this one is going to be, Mark is going to speak for around about 20 minutes is what we said when we planned this, but you know, give or take. And then there'll be about 10 minutes where it's just me and Mark kind of talking through, elaborating on a couple of issues. And then I'll open it up to the Q&As after that. So again, so it'll be about half an hour between Mark and myself, and then 15 minutes for the Q&A again. So I'm going to hand it back over now to Mark Taylor, who, as you can see from the screen in front of you, is co-author with Orion Brooke and Dave O'Brien of the book Culture is Bad for You, and you probably guessed that that's the book that inspired this event. When we were approached to organize this event, it was Mark was one of the people I wanted to get involved, because it's a really, really great book, which has a lot to tell us. But Dr. Mark Taylor is a senior lecturer in quantitative social sciences, and he's the AHRC Leadership Fellow at the University of Sheffield. I'll hand it over to you, Mark. Take it away.
Great. Thanks very much, Rich. Originally, the reason why it was me that was doing this presentation was because I was the one Yorkshire-based co-authors of this book. Two things have obviously happened since then. The first one is that with this having gone online, Orion's 5-hour train journey would no longer be such an issue. And also Dave has now moved to Sheffield with me. But here we are. I will do my best to give the energy and enthusiasm of 3 authors. As Rich says, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the content from the book Culture is Bad for You. There's a lot to squeeze in into 20 minutes. So I'm going to try and focus particularly on some of the themes which I think are particularly relevant to an audience who's interested in Telly. I can also, if you're interested in the book, but you are less interested in a physical object, the audiobook came out shortly before Christmas, narrated by Nneka Okoye, which we're all super happy with. So a lot of people will be fairly familiar with a lot of the themes that motivated the book, but I'll talk through some of them anyway. And a lot of these are around sort of recognitions and acknowledgements of social inequalities in creative work, which have become more and more prominent in the last, I would say, 5 years. There's certain largely actors, if we're honest, who are sort of ended up being the face of social inequality. This report from The Guardian highlights Eddie Redmayne, Benedict Cumberbatch, Tom Hiddleston, Lawrence Fox. They're all posh, they're all white, they're all men. Increasing concern that social inequalities are increasingly bad in creative work, such that only certain kinds of people are able to get these sorts of jobs and thrive in them. It's not limited to social class, which is the focus of the previous slide. The controversy of Oscars so BAFTA So White, Oscar So White from a few years ago. It was a very high profile example of this in broadcasts in the UK, but it's not just publicly subsidised art forms. It's not just things to do with acting. This is also a concern that has been raised in, I was surprised to discover the reports in BJ magazine, but this is actually one of the best ones that I've seen. It's really well reported. They've done a ton of work. And when we write about this, we try to draw attention to different axes of social inequality, reflecting intersectionality, change over time or absence, and so on. But it's always received like this. The interpretation is always, where are the working class people? Here's a picture of Maxine Peake, or here's a picture of Judi Dench, or whatever. It's interesting in policy terms at the moment, because I don't know if people are aware that Nadine Dorries, who's the current DCMS minister, who's had a cracking couple of days in the media, is herself notionally concerned about social class prejudice. And so all of this goes to some sort of explanation of where the work was coming from. But the other thing that's going on, the other thing in the background, is this sort of framework of the arts or culture, whatever you want to call it, being good for you. Work coming from the DCMS Select Committee, coming from the HRC, and coming from the WHO. These are all reports looking into the benefits, the value, the impact of participation. And from our perspective, it all felt a bit positive, it all felt a bit glossy. Different big, sensible organisations, esteemed organisations, were asking questions about, okay, tell us all the good things about arts and culture. And we as a team have been very conscious of maybe what you might slightly spectacularly call the dark side. And so we wanted to unpack it in a little bit more detail. Primarily going to talk about film and TV, but I want to give a little bit of background into some broader questions about who works in creative industries and also consumption within creative industries. One of the things that is absolutely amazing when you present to film and TV audiences, when you talk to people who work in the media, is they are astonished at how few people actually engage in a bunch of different art forms. I showed a slide a little bit like this at a panel of people who I can't tell you about, and the jaws were basically on the floor, where I said, in the last 12 months, about 23% of people went to a play or drama, about 3% of people went to contemporary dance, about 4% of people attended any video art. I suspect 3 out of those 4% of people hated it from my experience of video arts, and these things are all very heavily socially stratified as well. Even film, about 2/3 of people who are in managerial professional households, by which we mean the main income earner in that household works in a managerial professional job, compared with a smidge under 50% of people in what we would effectively call working class households. But if you think film and TV, if you think film's bad, other art forms are much more striking. People going to art exhibitions, a very clear example of this. About 28% of people in middle class households went to an art exhibition in the most recent year, in which you can ask sensible questions about this. It's tricky to say in the last 12 months how this would work, compared with single digits of people in working class households. Sometimes people are skeptical of survey work. So, and when you look at ticketing data, the results are exactly the same. And one of the explanations for why cultural consumption is so heavily socially stratified is because the people working in it is about more than half the people working in film, TV, video, radio, and photography. That might sound like a slightly odd category, but it's how it's measured by the Office of National Statistics, although, data that we've seen from Ofcom, Ofcom is actually the organisation that collates this the best, shows that, if anything, this is an underestimate for film and TV. More than half of them are from middle-class backgrounds compared with the overall workplace. This is, the overall workforce. This is more or less in line with the creative industries. We wouldn't argue that film and TV are uniquely bad, But similarly, you sometimes hear people in film and TV say, oh, well, you know, subsidized theatre, classical music, that's all full of posh people. Whereas the more commercially oriented film and TV sector is much more ruthless. We'd never let that kind of discrimination slide. That just isn't true. It hasn't really changed over time. You know, it bounces up and down. When you look over the last sort of 5 years, maybe a little bit more, you see that these trends are very consistent. You also see that almost all the jobs in film, TV, video, radio, photography are done by men, about 71% of them, and about 91% of them are done by white people. In the overall workforce, about 87% of people are white, so that's already an overrepresentation in film, TV, and so on. But what that doesn't take into account is the fact that so much of film and TV work takes place in London. We've already heard about this from John and Rowan, but it's always worth reinforcing. And London is only about 60% white people. That this 91% figure starts to look even more egregious. I'm not just going to hammer you with numbers and figures, but it's worth making explicit that some of the sort of mechanisms that are underlying this. One of them is almost everyone works for free, at least at some point in their careers. About 80% of people that we found working in film and TV from some primary survey work that we did had worked for free at some point. About a third of them had at some stage done an unpaid internship. Now, while working for free more broadly doesn't seem to be particularly socially stratified among people working in creative industries, almost everyone seemed to have done it at some point. Unpaid internships are quite an interesting example where it seems to be getting worse. Last thing I want to say in this section is to reflect on the churn as well. That huge number of people working in a given creative industry at one point, when you look at their answers to different censuses over time, I don't know if anyone remembers filling in the census last year and exactly what you said, that there are sort of big generational differences here. But one thing that sometimes comes up as a bit of a surprise is that the fraction of women leaving creative industries relative to men is actually fairly similar, or has been fairly similar, over the last 40 years or so. We're a little bit skeptical of whether this will still be the case for the younger cohorts, but ask us in a couple of years when the census results come out. Big reason for this is just the tiny numbers of women who are working in these sectors, you know, a handful of decades ago. Last thing to say, this is new, this isn't in the book, is that you will hear a lot about the pandemic and the disastrous impacts that the pandemic had on people working in film, TV, and so on. That's broadly true. However, the number of people working in these sectors increased. When you look at it in purely sort of economic terms, film and TV did all right out of the pandemic when you compare it to other bits of the creative industries. And in particular, film and TV did pretty well out of furlough. A lot of people, you know, going from February through to last summer, summer of 2020, far fewer of them were working what you might call full-time hours, with all the qualifiers that phrase should accompany. But they were staying in the sector. Again, if you compare this with something like live performing arts, the number of people who had no work at all exploded over the course of the year, even adjusting for the fact that huge numbers of people left the sector entirely, whereas by contrast, in film and TV, the number of people working in the sector actually increased. That's enough numbers. What I want to talk a bit more about now is some of the work that we did for the book, where we did a number of interviews with people working in creative industries. I'll start with a couple of comments from people working in different creative industries, but then I'll talk a little bit more about people working in film and TV specifically. We use this concept of the somatic norm to refer to basically the default worker in creative industries. Lots of the people that we spoke to, this is derived from concepts from Nirmal Poa, who worked a lot to analyse and understand the British civil service, where, you know, the somatic norm of a civil servant is a quite stiffly dressed, middle class, white man. And anyone who deviates from this tends to have questions asked about them. This was maybe encapsulated most directly by Sam, who works in museums, who said to us, you know that feeling when you feel like someone is going to tap you on the shoulder and say, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be here. You're not posh. You're not supposed to be here. Contrast this with someone like Lydia, who at the time was in her late 20s. We were asking her about, one of the questions that we asked our participants was about what it was like growing up, what their experiences were like. And you can see from her answers that everything was sort of lined up. Everything was built and structured in such a way that the transition into being a creative worker was relatively natural. Her quote here is fairly tongue-in-cheek, but when she says, everybody went to art class as a child, didn't they? Something to do on a Saturday morning, didn't we all? She lists all the different things, and she acknowledges that she was very fortunate. But we can maybe contrast what she said with moving forward a bit to a quote from Chris, who was a mixed race worker in museums, who was in his mid-30s, talking about his experience of getting access to early roles. So talking about when he was doing an MA, he said that you could plot your financial status against opportunity and you'd see a direct correlation. He drew attention to a couple of things, a few examples, things like the amount of money required to pay for an MA in the first place, and then having done so, the amount of things like volunteering work that people are able to do once they're on said MA. In his case, he was working part-time, which made volunteering tricky. Secondly, he wasn't based in London, and so he contrasts himself with other people, with his peers who lived with their parents during their master's programs in London, and consequently were able to volunteer at what he calls these huge national institutes like the British Museum, the V&A. He says that it looks really, really good on a CV. And that tells us a little bit about some of the sort of more tangible things that are important in relation to a somatic norm. But I also want to talk a little bit about some softer issues. And in particular, I don't just want to talk about people getting access to a first role. One of the things that comes through very strongly from the interviews that we've done is that while getting a first job is important, staying in that job, getting a second job is a real challenge for people who don't conform to a somatic norm. So this is a quote from John, who is not originally from the UK, and he was telling us, and he works in film and TV. He works in production in film and TV. And he was saying that, the kinds of people who do well in film and TV, middle-class white people, because they know how to talk to the people who can commission their ideas. He told us that even in the interview that he was doing with us, that he'd had to modulate his slang, having to modulate the kind of language that he used to make himself comprehensible, even to the interviewer. He said that he was putting on his TV voice. And he says that, in relation to TV production companies hiring people of colour, he describes having a little banter about which French Alps are the best to ski down. At this point, I'm going to move to quotes from 3 other people who were working in film and TV. And I'm going to contrast those with somebody else shortly. So the first one is somebody who is a woman of colour who works in film production and TV. And she was telling us, and this was after a conversation about differences between working internationally and in the UK, which we'll come back to. I really appreciated her just putting it very directly. Some of our other interviewees danced around this issue at all. Danced around the issue a little bit. But she said, UK film industry is not a meritocracy at all. It doesn't matter if you're intelligent or well qualified. It's massively to do with being a woman of colour, because people are fucking racists. They would much rather hire the white dude and feel more comfortable with them than the bullshit brown woman who seems to have done things they don't feel comfortable with. And later in the interview, she mentioned this point, which came through really strongly in a number of the interviews that we did, where she said, I don't think it's my duty to be making, I don't want to be making like worthy films about diversity. A lot of people of colour that we spoke to working in film and TV indicated that they were getting offers, but the offers weren't necessarily things that they wanted. Again, with this, one of the ideas of the somatic norm is that if you conform to it, you can do whatever you want. You can write science fiction, you can write a crime drama, you know, you can more or less take on any role that you want. Whereas this person said to us that, you know, she was getting offers, but it was about making worthy films about diversity. And it speaks to an issue that one of our other interviewees told us about, also working in the sector, who was talking to us about how she quite often gets approached and she quite often gets asked to do things, but it's not necessarily things that she wants to do. And it tends to coincide with funding deadlines, where if there's a funding deadline coming up, she'll often get approached by different partners, different industry organizations, saying that they need to show some kind of diversity. At that point, she'll get invited to go for a drink. 10 minutes later, they'll get an email asking for a letter of support. And so while there is some level of enthusiasm, it's relatively surface level. But we can contrast this maybe with one of our other interviewees who was a little bit more experienced. It's a black woman in her 50s, very, very experienced working in television, telling us about when she was getting started. She was on a program and she explained that she put together a script and done a voiceover and had asked somebody up the chain whether it was okay. And they said that it was fine, all no problem. And this really knocked her confidence, as you can imagine. And she took it to somebody that she worked with at the university. And he said, well, yours is written from the perspective of a black woman. This is written from the perspective of somebody who's not white and middle class. And so what this indicates to us is that while there's been a certain amount of change over time in the language that gets used, in the way that people understand diversity and talk about diversity, the overall effects are the same. That people's commitment to what we might call the somatic norm, which is now unspoken, they never say it out loud, means that people who don't adhere to the somatic norm get squeezed out. This is particularly relevant in relation to having children. The next couple of examples are derived from theatre, but we see sort of echoes of this in a number of different industries, where one of our, somebody was telling us about an experience that she'd had where she said, I got married and then I got pregnant. They said to me, do you want to come back? I said, yes, but I don't think that I can be doing the hours that I've been doing. To which the response was, well, you can't come back. And similarly, there was a discussion about somebody who was telling us about their experience of touring, that it wasn't just, and this is somebody who didn't have children at the time. And she was telling us that all the women who went on this tour, the cast and the crew, didn't have kids and they were single. Whereas all the men did have kids, but you know, they didn't bring the kids with them. They let their female partners handle all the childcare. But not only that, not only was it not possible for women with children to travel, the women without children who were traveling were then denigrated by these same men for saying that, you know, I've got children and you're lacking. This is a personal failing on your part. I don't want to go on forever. So I'm just going to contrast this with somebody that we spoke to who did conform to the somatic norm, who was very open with us. We were talking about how he had got into his first role and how that had gone. And he'd interviewed for a job where, and you know what he said, he told us explicitly, he knew nothing about the art form. And he thought that he would spin his ignorance of the art form as a sell, as a fun thing. And he says somehow that worked, which we slightly in tension with the claim that he was the only person that they saw. And when we talked to him about experiences of discrimination, there's a sort of equivocation where he says that we don't discriminate too badly, but then at the same time, all the big famous people in the top tier role. You know, I don't want to be too specific, but imagine this is a conductor or a choreographer or a director of photography or something like that. And women do all the real work. And again, he's equivocating. He acknowledges these problems, but then he says, but we're not the worst offender, you know, of any industry in the world. But and when we push him, when we asked him a little bit more about his experiences, he said that this came back to questions of recruitment, that when he's been on a lot of panels, and this is somebody who's personally very, very committed to diversity, he says, what are you going to do? You're going to pick the one with the best education. We can talk about diversity all we like, and we can mean it until our hearts are breaking. But in the end, when you've got one post to fill, you really don't want to fuck it up. And at this point, I think it's really helpful to think about Doris Eichhof's work, Amanda Coles' work, about conceptions of risk and the idea that hiring a white man is generally seen as the least risky recruitment strategy, even though we know in execution the opposite tends to be true. And so eventually he acknowledges we're pretty much forced into maintaining the undiverse status quo because the damage has been done before we get to the point at which we could inflict any damage. So, how can we think about this? The first thing to say is that it's impossible to separate inequalities within the cultural sector from the fact that cultural production and consumption take place in unequal societies. The problems that we're describing are not unique to culture. Culture reflects inequality and inequality reflects culture, but there is a question of the extent to which culture either mitigates or exacerbates these problems. A lot of the people that we spoke to were very skeptical of inclusion, diversity, and career development policies. There are a number of well-meaning people trying their best, but and it's often helpful for getting people into a first job, but it's less useful for getting people into a second. And we don't think that structures that support the exclusion of people who don't adhere to the systematic norm are likely to be changed purely through goodwill. There's a number of people who really do mean well and really who are trying their best. But yeah, when we did these interviews, when we were talking to people, there was a general acknowledgement that people were trying, but we weren't trying that hard. And the extent of the challenge really outpaced what's possible to accomplish through kindness and warmth. On that cheery note, I'll stop. Rich and I will probably have a chat for a couple of minutes, and then I imagine that there might be some questions more generally. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Mark. Really, really interesting. And yeah, I think I should probably have a cut of royalties from the book because the amount of people I've recommended this book to since it came out. But yeah, I'd encourage everyone who's here, and obviously if you're here, you're interested in this issue, to get yourself a copy because it's got some really great data and analysis in there.
When MUP does a sale, which is occasionally at £6.
There you go. Good value as well. Quite rare in academic publishing as well. Yeah, so I've got loads of possible questions and talking points we could get into. I don't want to monopolize things though, but I'll just ask a quick couple. So in preparing for this, I was partly thinking as well about another recent book, 2019 came out, which is this one. So it's called The Class Ceiling: Why It Pays to Be Privileged by Sam Friedman and Daniel Lorison. Another really, really great piece of, it's a sociological approach to class and privilege and things like that across a range of sectors. And one of the things they point out really chimes with something that you were talking about then, Mark, which is this idea of what they call getting in versus getting on. You put it in terms of getting your first job versus getting your second job. So they point out that sociologists and politicians often think about social mobility exclusively in terms of getting your foot in the door, starting in a particular line of work. But as Friedman and Lorison rightly point out, this assumes that social mobility stops at the point where you first get into an industry. So their argument is that we need to be thinking not just about getting in, but getting on. So how easy is it for people within a given job to progress upwards? So for example, they say that people from a working class background tend to sort into less prestigious specialisms within a given industry, and rarely do they reach the top of an organizational hierarchy. But your research, Mark, was very specifically about the cultural and creative industries and occupations. So could you just say a little bit more about the distinction between getting your foot in the door versus getting on, and what your data revealed about the ability or inability for certain people to progress once they got their first job?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I mean, so it's worth saying that within Daniel and Sam's book, one of the case studies that they draw on extensively is a media organisation. One of the things that I think is especially helpful about their analysis is to talk about how different kinds of professional jobs have quite different cultures. And one of the things that's distinctive about the cultural sector, and I think film and TV really exemplifies this, is the extent to which people in the sector think of themselves as the good guys. You know, they think, oh, you know, we're not accountants, you know, we don't work in the private sector, we don't work in banking, we're the good people, we're making things better. When you sort of contrast this with people in, for example, accountancy, there's no sort of pretense that it's a moral exercise, that it's a kind of moral virtue. And one of the consequences of this is that media industries, creative industries can actually feel more exclusionary. That, you know, the sort of in-jokes that people are adopting, there's maybe not that level of self-reflection. There's the belief that, well, because we're already in the sector, we must be the good people. We must be the people who are doing the good moral work. And so, you know, there's examples of like very, very subtle exclusions in the media case study in The Glass Ceiling around sort of in-jokes, you know, like mastery of lots of different kinds of cultural references in meetings, sort of winks and nudges, wherein, you know, people who maybe don't have that set of cultural references might find themselves quite excluded. You know, a lot of creative industries, by thinking of themselves as a bit, you know, above stuffy formalities, actually end up reproducing social inequalities to a greater extent than, you know, an organisation that actually knows how to run a meeting properly. I mean, I know your question was, what did we find? And I told you even more about what Sam and Daniel did, but a lot of the themes that we talk about are really echoed there and vice versa. And I think this sort of in-depth, one of the things that it's a shame that we weren't able to do in the book is sort of really in-depth ethnographic work, which The Glass Ceiling does do in that media organisation. And the stories that Sam will tell you about those staff meetings are absolutely amazing.
Yeah, really, really. And again, another excellent book to kind of recommend. Another thing I just wanted to, and by all means, everyone listening, please do start typing your questions in the chat. If you have any, you could be sharing a story of your own or a question you have for Mark. But yeah, I'll ask one more question before we hand over to other people. In your presentation, particularly the early part where you had all that quantitative data and infographics and stats and things, you had sort of graphs of, like, you know, how things compare across different cultural fields. And you mentioned that a lot of them look very, very similar to one another. You did show one that I wasn't entirely sure what it was showing. Was it consumption? There was one that was film was markedly different to other industries. So it's like,
So I can tell you a little bit about this. So this is data that's taken from the Taking Part survey. So this is a survey which pre-pandemic ran every year, big survey of sort of like the adult population in England, asking people what they've engaged in the last 12 months. And of this list of items, film is the only one that more than half the population, more than half the adult population is engaged in the last 12 months. So to that extent, film really is an outlier. At the same time, and, you know, I would always defend the importance of quantitative data to understand what's going on at a macro scale. I think it's really important. At the same time, it is quite blunt instruments as it's applied here. I saw there was a question in the chat about the social stratification of TV. The data that we have isn't particularly good. Again, it's a relatively blunt instrument because almost everyone watches TV. But not everyone watches the same things. You know, from qual work and from sort of earlier work, I don't know if people are familiar with the book Culture Class Distinction by Tony Bennett, Mike Savage and colleagues. It's very clear that the kind of telly that you watch, the kind of films that you're attending, you know, look as socially stratified, if not more, than a lot of what I'm showing you here. So, you know, I'm very excited about BBC Three coming back.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's a distinction we can all feel in film and media studies in particular. Like, you look at the number of publications on stuff like The Wire and The Sopranos that came out 20 years ago, and then compare that to what people actually watch on TV, and it's kind of night and day a lot of the time. Okay, we'll start the Q&A then. We've got a couple of questions and comments in the chat. So you've
panel session. We have the recording, we have all the panelists here. Welcome everybody. So my name's Professor Cathy Johnson, and I'm Professor of Media and Communications at the University of Huddersfield. The aim of this final panel session is to give an opportunity to have a sort of more open and free-flowing discussion around the theme of I guess moving forward from some of the research that we've heard. What needs to change? How do we bring about that change? And what further research might support that change? Being aware that this is an event that brings together both academic researchers and people who work in the industry, and thinking about how we can make that as productive as possible. We have 45 minutes for the segment overall, and in the schedule, 30 minutes of that is for a panel discussion. And then the last 15 minutes is opening that up to the floor for questions. However, I'd really like to encourage people to post questions as we go, because I think there's a real opportunity here for us to have a more open discussion. So if we're getting a lot of questions from the floor, I will foreshorten the time that I spend asking questions and extend the time that we have for questions and comments from the floor. So as a reminder, as soon as we move to the Q&A segment, the recording will be switched off, so that's not going, that's not going to be recorded, to give people the freedom to ask or say anything they want. And if you want to post an anonymous question or an anonymous comment, you can just send it to me in the chat, indicating that you don't want to be identified, and I can read that out on your behalf. Also, once we go into the Q&A, you can raise your hand to ask your question directly, or if you have a comment for the panel, so that there's an opportunity to engage in discussion with the panel. And we're really open here to questions, but also comments and experiences as well. So I think that's the sort of setup. Just a reminder to those not on the panel, when you're not speaking, can you please make sure that you mute your microphone? We had a little bit of sound interference in the last session, so just a reminder just to check and mute your microphone. And the final thing I wanted to say is that some of the panel have caring responsibilities, so if they turn off their cameras at any point, that's the reason, and just we would obviously be understanding of that. I think that's all the admin to get that out of the way. So some of the panelists have spoken already, some haven't. I'm aware that some people might have joined just for this session. So I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then I've got a whole host of questions, but as I said, please start posting your questions into the chat as well. So I'm just going to go in the order that people appear on my screen. So I'm going to start with Natalie. Natalie, can you just please quickly introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Nat. I am a freelance series producer, mainly in reality and entertainment television, but I'm also one of the co-directors of Share My Telly Job. I'm on the committee for the Telly Mums Network. And yeah, I was involved obviously in the Time Project, but also in some work that the University of Nottingham did last year about the experience of mums during the pandemic. So yeah, that's me.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Mark, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Mark. I am based at the University of Sheffield. I'm an author of the book Culture is Bad for You, along with Dave O'Brien and Orion Brooke, which I can assure you is very reasonably priced and has an excellent audiobook version. I am interested in social inequalities in and around creative work and sort of culture more generally, and most of the work that I do involves quantitative methods.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark. John, you're next on my screen.
Hi everyone, so I'm John, I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of York, and I work on the Screen Industries Growth Network and a connected project called XR Stories. My kind of academic discipline is geography. I'm interested in the geographies of the creative industries and kind of working practices therein, and I was involved with the research on the Time project.
Brilliant, thank you, John. And last but by no means least, Marcus.
Hi, I'm Marcus. I'm Head of External Consultancies at the Sir Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity. And I've done, if I'm plugging books, taking it from Mark, I've written Access All Areas with Lenny Henry, which is a diversity manifesto for TV and beyond. And my latest one is Black British Lives Matter, also co-edited with Lenny.
Both fantastic books I'd highly recommend. So yes, very much so. So thank you very much. I wanted to start. I was fortunate enough to be given a sneak preview of the Time project report. And one of the things that struck me reading that report was just the complexity of the issues, trying to understand how these inequalities play out across different kinds of job roles, different kinds of working conditions, different kinds of contracts, different sets of issues, whether that's caring responsibilities, racism and racial discrimination, or discrimination across multiple intersecting identities, work cultures, work expectations. I could go on. So my first question is, I guess to John and Nat, but I'm really open to anybody, is how do we try to untangle this kind of complexity, but without oversimplifying or becoming too reductive? And I wondered what thoughts you'd had on, maybe perhaps start with John and Nat, what thoughts you'd had on that when you're actually dealing with that data, and then I might open it up to Mark and Marcus if they have any thoughts on that as well.
I've already spoken a lot, so Nat, do you want to start?
Thanks, John. I was going to say that one was more your thing, but sorry, Catherine. So, do you mean in terms of where do we go with the?
Well, just how do we approach that? Do we take specific issues? Do we need to look at, like, say, people on specific contracts, or people or different roles at different times, or are there things that we can read across those different kinds of roles and working conditions and identities? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, traditionally, maybe part of the problem of why there's been so little progress is that we do tend to look at things, when we look at different issues facing different underrepresented groups separately. But actually, a lot of the solutions, as I would see it, a lot of the solutions that would be good for one group would actually be good for lots of underrepresented groups. So one thing that came out when we were doing the motherhood report with Nottingham last year, a lot of the recommendations that we found that would help mums would also help people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or would also help people, disabled people, all that, it's all different groups we will all benefit from a kinder working culture, I think. And perhaps, historically, maybe we've tried to look at it too separately. I don't know.
Thanks for that. John, did you have anything to add?
I think you're absolutely right to raise the complexity of the issues. When we were developing the pilot and honing the questions, it took me so long to understand how people are paid in TV. I'm a reasonably intelligent person, but just for different kinds of contracts, for different lengths of them, for different ways that people are paid, whether they're PAYE freelance, or whether they're paid for a direct company, whether they do their own tax return, what's included in what people are charging, where the rates are come from, whether people are actually working at the rate that they should be or not. So I think untangling some of that, and those of us who work in departments which are teaching students who want to go into this industry, I think it's really important to unpick that. In terms of what we need to kind of focus on, one of the things I'm interested in picking up following on from this project is really understanding why people are made to work such long hours. And over the past couple of years, when I've been speaking to people in TV, I've jotted down a few reasons that people cite, which include, and this is a non-exhausted list, directors being too precious and wanting to get lots and lots of shots in the can, even when they've already got it, or directors not knowing what they want, so overshooting. People being inexperienced because they haven't had time to train, and because of the skills gaps. Some people just being bad at their job, so it takes longer to do things. Production companies under budgeting to win commissions or promising things quicker than realistic. Pressure from broadcasters to turn things around incredibly quickly. Long hours, contributing to long hours. If people are tired, things take longer to do. Last minute changes mean you have to replan things. The weather and general poor working conditions, making it longer to do things. Taking crew from London to film in Newcastle when you could have local crew. So I think unpicking all those different factors and then combining it with the kind of understanding the characteristics and the discrimination and exploitation within that, I think is important.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful. Marcus or Mark, did you have anything to add on that? We've got a follow-up question from the Q&A, but just before I go to that.
Mark, do you want to go ahead?
A very boring point that I do want to sort of flag, which is about exactly what constitutes work. So, you know, if you're a freelancer, is time that you're pitching for stuff work? Is time that you're spending auditioning for stuff work? Obviously, you know, like Time Project is a sophisticated piece of work, and it's not as if you're unaware of these things. But I'm thinking more sort of qualitatively that when people think about the number of hours that they're spending working, they're often not thinking in terms of, oh, well, you know, I went to this audition and it didn't go anywhere. So that's, you know, that's part of my job. Because once you start taking all of these things into account, you know, like, is getting a haircut a job? Part of work. And because if you start taking all of these things into account, then the already big numbers that the Time Project is you know, is measuring just get even more out of control.
And that was something that we originally looked at factoring in, wasn't it, John? I think we were, you know, there were conversations around whether we were to do that, and we decided against it in the end, because like you say, it's all the time. You know, I will sometimes sleep if I'm on a big job, with a notepad at the side of my bed, because I wake up in the middle of the night with a thought about something I need to remember to do, or a thing to add into the script. So I think the very nature of working in television is that you sort of don't ever switch off. But yeah, how do you measure that? I don't know.
Okay.
Marcus?
I think the very hard thing for a lot of Black people, people from underrepresented groups, Black people, Asian people, disabled people, is trying to articulate the alienation that they feel within the TV industry. You know, Lenny's talked about this being the only one, and, you know, and lots of people have articulated this, but it's a toxicity of that alienation. And so what you have, if you have these because we have these long working practices and culture, right? What you're asking people to do is to be extremely isolated, right? So it's not just, so it actually impacts people from underrepresented groups in a different manner as well. Or there's an extra layer of isolation when you're working those hours, where you do not have your support structures and what have you. It's amazing how many people that I've spoken to, and, you know, it's dangerous to extrapolate from just anecdotal conversations, but I will do that though. But it's amazing how many people, now that there's more shifting working from home, right? And not just talking about it in terms of it's great, I don't have a commute, but they're talking about it in that they're not going into what they perceive to be a toxic environment. And if you're making people work incredibly long hours in what is fundamentally a toxic environment, or one where people feel incredibly isolated, that's an extra dimension that needs to be acknowledged.
I think that's a really important point, actually. And just the fact that if you're having to perform a different put on a version of your identity to pass or to fit in, or to, that some of the things that Mark, you came out, I think, in some of the quotes that you were referring to from your book, and then you don't have any time to switch off because you're not even getting a break. I think that's a really, really important point. We have a question here about how do you measure for intersectional identities? So the impact of certain issues on someone, say, who is a mother and Black versus mothers or people who are Black or Asian. So I don't know whether there are any thoughts on that from anyone in the panel. Anyone want to take that one?
I was discussing this literally just last night with an academic that specializes in intersectionality. And I think what's important is to try and work out why we're looking at the intersectionality. And so there can be a tendency to use intersectionality as a way of looking at a hierarchy. Think of it as a hierarchy of oppression, so that white women are oppressed, but a Black woman will be oppressed more. A Black woman who is a mother who will be oppressed more. A Black woman who is a mother who's disabled will be oppressed more, and what have you. And as a tool in terms of looking at discrimination, I'd say there are some flaws in that, or some criticisms on that, but I can see the utility in that. The other way of looking at intersectionality is, what does that identity bring, which is new, fresh, and innovative to the production, and what is the benefit for that intersectionality? And I think it's important that when we're talking about intersectionality, we look at both aspects, and we're clear what we're talking about when we frame our conversations. Looking at this question, I'm assuming it's looking at it in terms of discrimination or adversity that somebody might face. And as I said, I think it's important that intersectionality is incredibly important, but I think it's important that we don't think of it solely in just hierarchical terms, in that we make sure that we tailor our solutions to people's intersectional or multiple identities.
Yeah.
So we just need to. So I'm just worried that we don't create a hierarchy of oppression.
Yeah, absolutely. There was actually a Twitter thread that was very similar to that about some of these issues in academia, which was, ending up with a sort of hierarchy which leads to a race to the bottom. Well, these people have it worse, or at least it's not, and how that is really, really not useful. The next question I wanted to pick up on related to the conversation that Rich and Mark were having about data. And so one of the challenges, I think, can be a relative lack of reliable data. And again, reading the Time Project report, I noticed that some of the difficulties in trying to just assess the representativeness of the sample because of the lack of detailed data about the makeup of the film and television industries, as opposed to sort of the very broad data that I think Mark was drawing on. So I'm just curious here about what might be the challenges in terms of data, and what are the data barriers. And I wonder if partly the issue here is who we're comparing ourselves with. I've done some work with colleagues in Europe, and in Denmark, for example, the equivalent of BARB data on consumption of television is available at a really, really cheap rate for academic research, which means that then academics can do all sorts of really, really interesting research that we can't do in the UK because it's just too costly. We just can't afford that data. And that's just at the level of consumption. I also know that, for example, the DCMS committee into public service broadcasting last year was when they inquired around diversity from different players. Netflix wasn't able to give them any data on the diversity of the staff that they employed in the UK, for example. So I think there are all sorts of various issues around access to data. So I'm just sort of quite open question about what do you think are the data barriers, or perhaps the most important data barriers, and what steps we might take to try and address those or challenge those?
So one of the things that we're trying to address for lack of data in Yorkshire through Sign and Exile Stories is so Kate O'Connor, who's actually on the call today. Hi Kate. She's leading on a project called Inclusive Growth Project, thinking about how the screen industries in the region can grow in a more inclusive way. And one of the things we're trying to do with that is create a baseline to try and work out how many people do work in the region. And I think there's a number of different challenges even to that, even if we manage to carry out a census for the whole of the region, because there's questions about what counts as the screen industries, what counts as television. Thinking about including people that use YouTube and TikTok to make money, and influencers on Instagram, they're using similar techniques and similar media as you would think of kind of more mainstream traditional television, but including them I think is particularly important. And then also at a national scale it's not too difficult, but when you get to a subnational scale, what counts as the Yorkshire and Humber TV industry? Is it just those people that live in the region and companies registered in the region, or is it people that come into the region from Manchester to work? What if you've got a company who's working on a production which has been commissioned from London and they're filming in Cumbria? Is that a Yorkshire production? So I think the more you look, the more complex it gets.
Yeah, there are real challenges there. I'm going to move on unless anyone else wants to come into that.
There is one other thing I want to throw in, if that's possible. So, you know, it's a data question, so inevitably I've got quite a lot of opinions. I would make one distinction and one sort of flag one other thing that's maybe a challenge, which is that when you said that, you know, Netflix wasn't able to share data on diversity of its teams, it could have done. Like, Netflix has done quite a lot in the US with USC Annenberg. They haven't done it here. Netflix has got a lot of money. It is not beyond them to do this kind of work.
Oh yeah.
Perhaps, like, I would say they are not willing to do the work. And so the distinction I would make is sort of public sector, public funding versus more commercially oriented distinction, wherein BBC, but also sort of large, like, you know, most organizations that are funded by the Arts Council, for example, the data's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And because there is this compulsion, it's part of the funding agreement that this will get reported on. It's much, much, much trickier in bits of the commercial sector for a lot of the reasons that we would expect. The other real issue around data use in this sort of sector is a skills gap. You know, how many BAs in media and comms have compulsory quantitative methods training? There's some of us, but there's not very many. And I think, you know, my experience from talking to people is that, you know, if there are sort of analysis people in small organizations, obviously at big organizations it'll be different. There's not necessarily a great deal of support. People don't necessarily understand exactly what it is that they're doing. They'll be line managed by somebody in the marketing team. And, you know, this can be a real challenge. Or, you know, alternatively, if an organization gets a request for data and there isn't a dedicated person who handles it, that can be very tricky for them. You know, you want to make sure that it's correct, but if you don't necessarily have the skills within the organization, you can understand why people might be reticent.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, can I just come in on,
yeah,
on
sure.
the data thing? I'm not so sure I agree that things like the BBC data is very robust, if I'm being honest. I think that the BBC data is robust for direct staff that they employ, right? Even there, what is interesting is that you will have things such as they'll do it in pay grade, but not in terms of who is directing, who's writing, and what have you. So people who actually have editorial control, if we're trying to look at that then shape the culture of the teams, they don't hold. And even if they did, right, even if they did, like, let's say director, if you look at the Directors UK report from 2016, 2015, I think, something like that, or maybe about 2016. So it was a little while ago. They showed that Doctors, which is the soap, which is based in Birmingham, have the people of color is something like 20%. EastEnders was something like 1%. And so if the BBC were just to put directors, the budgets that they would be controlling would also be very different. So and then even with CDN data, right, the order of considering that it's not weighted, and it was really useful. John, when you were saying, I think it was John that said at the beginning that we didn't want to say that this was representative of the whole industry, right? If you look at CDN data, which is not weighted, right, and compare it to Directors UK data, which might not suffer from the same selection bias, there could be, right, there could be an order of magnitude of 500% difference between what CDN is reporting and what is the real picture. If the order of magnitude between what Directors UK is reporting in ethnicity of directors is the same throughout the industry compared to what CDN is reporting for its directors. So it could be a massive order of magnitude, right? And that's CDN. And don't get me wrong, CDN is, and I'm sure when I asked the question of Mark in the chat, is better than what's happening across Europe and lots of other places. But I'm just saying, often when I'm trying to sift through the data myself, I feel as if I could easily be blindsided by, tiny, not through malice. I know some people might put ill motives on some of the data collections. I don't personally, but I'm just saying it's data for anybody working in this field. And I'm sure Mark feels the same. I'm sure everybody feels the same. Is really difficult.
And it's got the potential to be used in all sorts of ways by different people. Nat, I know you wanted to come in on this.
Well, I was sort of partly Marcus's point about when I looked at something like the Ofcom diversity review that they did of 5 years worth of diversity data last year, that's only the people who are on staff contracts at the broadcasters. And when you read things that, like, they're saying that there's only 16% of women are over 50 within the broadcasters. From my own sort of lived experience, those 16% of the women who are there won't be in jobs which are directly out making the content, making the editorial decisions. Largely that is freelancers. And the way in which we have at the moment, traditionally the ways that we've got of monitoring freelancers, isn't really working. Like, from my own experience, I can think of a handful of times that I've been sent diversity monitoring forms. And I know in the early days when we were talking about developing the Time Project, I would often come back and think about my husband. He will hate me for saying this publicly, but we were having a conversation about all this. And, he's a white bloke in his mid-40s. He's a sound recordist. He doesn't identify himself as someone who needs to engage with conversations about diversity. But actually, he is exactly the kind of person that you need to be engaging in to get a true sense of what the picture is out there. And I asked him at that point, how many times have you ever filled in a diversity data form? How many times? And he was like, never, I don't think. I might have been sent them a couple of times, but I just delete them. And we worked out that he'd done in the previous year, he'd done something like 87 different contracts. And he'd not given over any data for any of this. So part of the motivation when we were developing the Time Project was this idea that if we can give back some of that data to people like him, which engages him to then give his data over, it will create a more robust picture, hopefully. And, we're only a few months into it, but in time, hopefully that will be what happens.
Thank you for that, Nat. I'm going to open up to the chat in a minute because we've got some really interesting questions and comments, but I wanted to ask one last question which follows on from this. I think one of the things that comes out of a lot of the work is is around the responsibility that broadcasters have. And so I have a question about how do we get broadcasters to take responsibility for workers across, to use management speak, across their supply chains. And I think, you know, if you think about some other areas, like say the fashion industry, there's been, and food manufacturing, there's been increased pressure for you know, the large brands to take responsibility for the working conditions of workers right the way through the supply chains. And I'm sort of wondering about what we can do to maybe to get people to think about, is it helpful to think about it in those ways? Is it helpful for people to be thinking, what are the conditions under which the programs that I love are being produced, right? To what extent should we be placing pressure on broadcasters to take responsibility for the inequalities, the working conditions of staff that they don't directly employ, but they do pay for through the work that they commission? I just wonder what people's thoughts are on that.
I can take that, but I feel like I'm talking a lot. So anybody else that wants to go first, I'd appreciate.
No, go for it, Mark.
I agree with things that Mark has said previously. That's why I said I'm a massive fan, Mark, because my experience is that people in the broadcasting industry and people high up do think they're the good guys, right? And so they do think that that they're that they're doing good stuff, and you know, they're not, I don't know, trying to put children up chimneys and you know, doing child labor in silica in Pakistan or whatever, you know. So they do think they're the good guys. My experience of regional diversity is that there were several attempts in the 90s to increase regional diversity with very well-meaning people, even quote unquote people from the nations and regions, right? But those efforts, and while there was progress, those efforts meant that were always diminished as people, London had a natural gravitational pull, right? Or don't know, natural is an emotive word, but things went back to London. And it took Ofcom and strong regulation to ensure that regional diversity was properly addressed. It's definitely not perfectly addressed by any stretch. I saw a question in there, right? But it's being addressed in a more systematic way than it ever was before Ofcom and before 2007, you know, happened. And so if we are going to address long working hours, I think there are things that broadcasters can do, and we can put pressure on them, and the union should put pressure on them, and we should all put pressure on them with regards to working practices and what have you. And we can all be good citizens, and we can all do these kind of things. And I think most of us work for organizations which are trying to do that. But the bottom line is that the people that shape and dictate the working environment is DCMS and Ofcom. And we need to ensure that our regulators are doing a good job.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Sorry, John, did you want to come in, or I was going to open it up to questions from the floor?
Just going to agree with Marcus, there has to be regulation, because subcontracting is designed to distance organisations from the conditions. That's why fashion brands do it. That's why cosmetic brands do it. It's designed to do that. I think there's also another point that a lot of people, most people outside the TV industry aren't aware of these issues, and also many people in TV aren't aware of these issues. I've spoken to people in TV over the past couple of years about the impact of the pandemic. And one of the questions I asked them is, who do you think will be most affected by this and the impact of the pandemic? And a lot of them can't think about other people that aren't like them. And they just can't imagine the circumstances that other people face in the industry.
Thank you, John. So we've got lots of questions from the floor. So I'm going to open up to those. So I've got a question for Mark. In terms of, this goes back partly to the data question, but I think it's a little bit broader. Are we just better in the UK at researching and talking about issues rather than changing things?
I mean, I don't know isn't a very helpful answer, but it's probably the accurate one. I mean, like, so I think the interesting thing for me is, and I think I've alluded to this already, is compare where we are to where we were, say, 10 years ago. And one of the sort of examples that I think about a lot is there was a report that came out, I think it was earlier this year, it might have been it's January, last year, about the relatively small amount of change that had happened in the fraction of people from working class backgrounds in professional jobs, where, in relative to 2 years before, it only changed by 2%. And my response to that was 2% is loads. If you're going to change by 2% every year, then that's fine. And that's actually indicative of progress. And, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see massive changes straight away. But at the same time, we can't say, oh, well, we've only just started to diagnose these problems. Don't ask me in a year, ask me in 10 years. Because then what will happen is you'll ask me in 10 years and we'll all say, oh, well, nothing seems to have happened. Let's see what happens in another 10 years' time. So I think we are very good at talking about the issues in the UK. I think that's definitely true. I agree that we are probably no better than a lot of other places in terms of actually changing things. But I also think there is something to be said about putting these things on the agenda. Like the fact that there's an all-party parliamentary group on creative diversity, the fact that this is on the agenda means that it is more difficult for people to hide, that, people are asking questions when there are sort of visible sort of monocultural groups producing big cultural products. I don't work in the sector. I'm not particularly attached to it, so I don't want to make any. Please don't see this as a spirited defence of it. But I think I would rather be good at researching and talking about the issues than not.
Thank you, Mark. So we slightly addressed this already, but just in case anyone else has anything to say about it. So it's a question about the thoughts on inequality presented by geographical divides, which is something that's come up a number of times. So the privileging of work and workers in the London. So we've seen the move of the BBC to Salford, Channel 4 to moving its headquarters to Leeds. Are these developments signs of progress in terms of regional diversity, or are they just papering over the cracks? And I guess that's probably more addressed to Nat and Marcus.
I mean, I could be wrong here, but from what I understand of the departments that moved to Leeds for Channel 4, it's not necessarily the big departments that are moving there. It's
it's digital, isn't it?
Yeah, and similarly with Salford, I know that they've more recently moved up things like BBC Breakfast, but in the early days it was sort of, I was working in Manchester at the time, sort of, what would it have been, 12, 15 years ago when it first opened. And it was a sense of sort of, they're putting the shows up here that won't make as big an impact. And actually, most of the people, they were given relocation fees to move up. I imagine over the last few years, that will have changed. But it feels a little bit performative, maybe, that those things happen. I don't know, what other people who perhaps know more about it than me, about what departments are there?
I think it's imperfect. I worked in Scotland from 2007 to 2016, I think it was. So I definitely think that it's better than it was. I worked in Manchester in 1993, and so there is both a change there's a qualitative and quantitative difference between the move to the nations and regions than there was in previously. Having said that, if you look at, for example, the views on impartiality, say, right, and the evidence that the BBC gave to the Commons Select, no, it wasn't Commons, I think it was the Lords Communications Select Committee. It was Londoners and editorial policy, which is massive, is still based in London. You know, there are different productions, but the vast majority of productions in news, so my specialism is news and journalism, that's my direct experience. Even though in Scotland I made productions, made panoramas, say, the ultimate commissioning role, the ultimate head of news, you know, the people who will decide, the people whose values are going to decide when there is a crisis, you know, are going to come down and decide whether we are going to use the N-word, whether to repeat the use of the N-word, for example, at prime time, and breakfast. So breakfast is a good example. Naga Manchetti, breakfast television in Manchester. But the people who then decide whether she has breached the editorial guidelines are Londoners, you know. And so while there is definite progress, and I would not want to, in any way, it would be churlish not to say there's massive progress for the nations and regions. But at the same time, we need to also recognize that London still, I think, still drives the culture when it comes to commissioning, and still drives the culture in many different ways. One of the things I'd quickly say, especially relevant with regards to the Time Project, is that when I first moved up, having worked in London, when I first moved up to Glasgow in 2007, I had embedded the London culture in me, that in order to make good current affairs, you had to come in at 9 and you had to leave at 9. You know, and I came into a team, and one of the things which I subconsciously thought as a manager was, I'm going to have to get these people to work longer hours. These people are just going home too early, right? And it was a learning experience for me as a manager to realize, and as exec producer to realize, that it wasn't necessary. There are times in a production cycle when you do have to work long hours. That's just the natural way of when you're coming up to certain pressure points, possibly for certain investigations, not always, but for certain investigations, you might need to do that when the lawyers' letters are coming in at horrible times and you know when your TX date is, so possibly. But it's also, as a manager, unlearning cultural practices, which I had accepted without thinking when I was working down in London.
Thanks, Marcus. And it's interesting that it takes a cultural move or a cultural shift to invite that self-reflexivity. We've got a question here. Oh, sorry, got that.
You can add into that about Glasgow. I had a very similar experience actually working up in Glasgow, and little things like on a Friday lunchtime, they might do a barbecue for everyone. And it was all very, and I wonder if that is in part because in the nations and regions, there is a smaller pool often of talent. And so there's less of a revolving door of, well, if you're not going to stay for 15 hours, we'll just get someone else in. And they nurture people. You know, I would notice, I was working, I worked at a few companies up there, but particularly at places like IWC and Raise the Roof, they would nurture people. And so people were sent on training and were, it felt like the management knew everyone on a more individual basis, which I think you don't necessarily get at some of the companies in London. And again, it's coming back to changing the sort of culture around the ways in which we work and nurturing people, not just the sort of, it's kinder to let people go home and see their families, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, and that is potentially a site for more research, actually, some qualitative research to unpack some of that. I've got a question here that's more to Mark and John. So this comes from someone who's an academic who's trying to think through how those of us working in higher education and teaching students from a range of backgrounds use the information generated from the research being discussed today to inform the way that we approach the work we do with students. So on the one hand, we're teaching students how to be researchers. So this is great, valuable, up-to-date information that we can share. It's knowledge, knowledge is power. On the other hand, part of our responsibility is to help students make informed choices and negotiate the realities of this sector. What's the ethical way to approach this as part of our duties? I think that's it's a question I think about a lot, and I don't have a good answer to. So I'm really hoping that John and Mark might have a good answer to this question.
No, I mean, yeah. So it's a bit different for me because I don't work in media and comms, but this is, like I've sometimes said, like as not totally sincere points, that what we're doing is we're doing analysis that shows that like working in these sectors is often poorly paid, is often exploitative, is often sort of unpleasant on a day-to-day basis, and so what we're suggesting is that more people from marginalized backgrounds should try to get into the sector. Like the tension in that position, I think, is reasonably obvious. I don't really have a solution. I mean, I think we have to be completely open. It would be very difficult, I think, to justify sort of selling the creative industries or media work or whatever else as, this is a great place, it's really encouraging, you're going to love it, no problems will possibly emerge. But I think it is realistic. Like, I think we want students to go in with their eyes open. I think, those of us that have worked in media and comms departments know that students come in really excited about the possibility, and it's worth being fairly explicit along the lines of, look, we know that you want to do this and we want to encourage you, we want you to feel positive about this, but there is some stuff that you should be aware of. And I know that's a bit of a fudge, but I don't really see what else we can do.
John, anything to add?
And join a union.
Yeah, I think
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to the need to. So I've moved to a department which teaches degrees, which produces students to go into the media industries, and the previous department was a geography department, and there's no obvious career path for geography students. So what we used to tell them was that we're going to provide you with a set of skills, and you can apply those in a number of different contexts. In my current department, it's explicitly we'll teach you how to make film and television, and so therefore you'll be equipped to go into that industry. What I notice as being missing from those is the not necessarily critical thinking, but kind of more activist skills, more radical approaches to understanding what's happening and changing it. It seems to be very much kind of technical. This is how you write a treatment. This is how you use a camera. This is how a studio works. I think within that, and potentially separately as well, we need modules which highlight these issues, explain where these issues emerge from, so that when these students graduate and do go into the industry, they're equipped with an understanding rather than just being exposed to it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I'm aware of time, but I'm going to ask one last question. We've got a number of questions that we haven't had an opportunity to address, but I wanted to sort of pick up a question that I think threads through a few of the different questions that we've had, which is about change and solutions. So are there any changes that we have seen recently or examples of good practice across any parts of the industry that any of the panelists would like to highlight or draw attention to? So things that are perhaps already happening, or if there aren't any, then maybe things that could happen that would leave us with something positive or to think about in terms of moving forwards. So I'm just going to open that up just to anyone on the panel if they have thoughts about, are there examples of good practice, or are there some solutions that you can see that are having sort of positive effect or change? That's a shocking silence, isn't it?
I think the regionality for its flaws does. I think that if you look at the BBC newsroom, it has increased its ethnic diversity. The double-edged sword of that is that there hasn't been it's doubtful there's been a real culture change, from my understanding, within the news department of the BBC, and that is because the increase in ethnic diversity, for example, and other forms of diversity have, with the exception of gender and white women gender to be specific and intersectional, has been concentrated in areas which are less culturally and editorially significant. So it hasn't been in Newsnight to the same degree, Today programme, Panorama as elsewhere. But you can see that there has definitely been increases in diversity, I would say. The issue, and I guess this speaks to the whole reason that we're here, is what does that mean if there aren't changes to inclusion and working practices? And that's why this is such important work that the Time Project is doing, because we need to not just increase headcount, we need to increase, or we need to change our working practices. We need to change inclusion. We need to look at issues of equality, And so while I agree with Mark that we are having discussions today that we weren't having 10 years ago, I think that too many of those new discussions, or the discussions, are still around headcounts, and we need to, like this is why this is such great work. We need to be having those discussions around working practices.
Thank you. Anyone else want to say anything, Nat?
You say about looking at career trajectories, and one of the things I'd read in the Ofcom report was about how, for the first time ever, we're at a point where more people are leaving the industry than are joining the industry. And what we do in terms of holding on to those people, because aside from anything else about diversity, and it doesn't make business sense to just keep losing everyone. So you would think that the broadcasters and the indies would think, well, it's not good for business that we keep losing everyone, but also how it kind of ties into, we read all these reports about bullying and harassment and awful toxic workplace cultures. And that's largely because there are no grown-ups there often. All the grown-ups have left. Anyone who is a bit older and with experience has gone. So I think we need to be looking a lot more at holding on to people and creating a sense that working in television is a job with longevity and not just a job. You have a bit of fun in your 20s, maybe till your mid-30s, but then you go and you do a proper job then.
Yeah, I think I am aware there has, I think, in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of the discussions, at least, I think there is an awareness, I think an increased awareness that issues of retention are really, really need to be addressed. And it's not just an issue of entry level kind of.
Well, not just in terms of kind of academic research, but also in terms of the kind of policies which are put in place, and the schemes and the quotas and all those things. Very often it is focused on getting people in. And, we all know that getting in is really, really difficult, especially if you're working class or from a Black or ethnic minority background or disabled or all those things. But to actually stay, and to stay beyond your first few jobs, to stay beyond 5-10 years is even more difficult, really.
Yeah. On that cheery note, I'm going to draw the panel to a close, and I want to really thank Natalie Grant, Mark Taylor, John Swords and Marcus Ryder for giving up their time today. We know how precious time is, for such an interesting discussion. I think we could have gone on probably for another hour. I know I have more questions, and I know that there are more, and there's some interesting questions and comments that I'd encourage people to read in the chat. So thank you so much again. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm just going to draw today's event to a close by just talking a little bit, really just for about 5 minutes, about a new project at the University of Huddersfield that we're going to be formally launching later this year, but that speaks directly to the issues that we've been talking about today. So we're going to be launching a project called the Yorkshire Film and Television Innovation Lab, situated within the Yorkshire Film and Television School here at the School of Arts and Humanities at the University of Huddersfield. And the Innovation Lab aims to address the systemic problems of of equality or inequality, diversity and inclusion within the film and television industries through the development of an experimental interdisciplinary method that draws on expertise from colleagues in media, performance and music. So that includes myself, my colleague Ben Spatz, who's co-leading the project with me, and my colleagues Jennifer Hesler, Eddie Dobson and Errol Salomon, as well as a number of other members of staff across the university. What we're aiming to do is to scope out, design and develop the Innovation Lab as a novel, interdisciplinary and practice-based methodology to address how to create more diverse, inclusive and equitable creative spaces and processes for the production of film and TV content. So we are really interested in precisely this issue of production cultures and working practices and working environments and cultures more broadly. So we envisage the innovation labs that we will run as being self-reflexive spaces, neutral spaces and participatory spaces that through which we can generate novel insights by working together with people who work in or have previously worked in the industry. So it's sort of inherently collaborative. And so one of the things that's really at the heart of the project then is the development of research questions and methods that don't just come from us academics sitting here in academia, but that actually come through our engagement with people who are currently working in or who have formerly worked in the industry. So there's a real commitment to generating questions, methods and recommendations through collaboration between academics and industry practitioners, and not just through talking, much as talking is really helpful and useful, but also through practice and through doing. And at the heart of the idea of a lab is that it is not just a space for talking, it's a space for doing and for practice. So the project will run from June 2022 for 3 years. We've just advertised for a research fellow to join us full-time on the project for the first 2 years. And if anyone is interested in knowing more about that research fellow post or about the project, I've put my email address in the chat. We're also, a central part of the project will be speaking to people in the industry who are engaged in addressing or concerned about discrimination and inequality, and who also might be interested in participating in any way in the project. So again, if you're interested, you want to know more, you'd like to get in touch, just email me using the email in the chat. So this is, it's said in the banner sort of launch, this is a kind of a soft launch, a slightly sort of early launch, but it seemed like a useful opportunity to talk about and draw attention to this project that we're going to be doing over the next three years. So as we draw this event to a close, I want to say a massive thank you to Richard McCulloch, John Swords, Harriet Camp and James Wilson, who have been doing loads of work behind the scenes in putting this really wonderful event together, to our brilliant participants, Rowan Ulst, Natalie Grant, Marcus Ryder and Mark Taylor, for really generously giving up their time to participate in today's event and for their really insightful and thoughtful contributions. And finally, thank you to everybody here who's participated for generating such interesting discussion. And I apologize that we didn't manage to get to quite all of the questions and comments in the panel at the end, but they were all really, really useful. We'll be sending out a post-survey event via Eventbrite. So if you can spare the time, please do fill it in so you can help us to improve our future events. And then really just to end, I think when we planned this event, I think as Richard mentioned earlier, we were aiming for a hybrid in-person and online format, which would have meant that it would have been my job at this point to invite those of us who are in person to join us for a nice drink and a nice informal chat. Unfortunately, as we've become perhaps a little bit too used to, COVID got in the way and had other ideas. So in the spirit of the research that we've heard today, I will end by encouraging you to finish your working day here, get yourself a drink or do some yoga, spend some time with your family, maybe put your feet up and watch some telly if that doesn't feel like too much work. And it just last thing to say is just again, thanks again for taking the time to attend today and for what's been just a really fascinating and interesting discussion.